So I want to talk this morning about the way in which the banking scandals that have made their way all across this planet and found themselves resting in the heart of every single home and in the wallet of every single American affect you and me and every single American and frankly people all around the world. You know, I had a conversation with an attorney that I respect very much yesterday, and we started talking a little bit about LIBOR, and this very, very bright guy who can quote baseball statistics and football statistics from heart, from memory, going back decades, admitted to me that he had no idea what LIBOR was, and frankly, he didn't care much about it because he didn't see how it affected his world. Well, it's a very, very dangerous attitude to take, and frankly, too many Americans do just ignore these kind of things. But LIBOR is both really, really simple, and it has a dramatic effect on every single American. And the fact that Americans aren't out in the street with pitchforks right now, and that frankly is a very dangerous phenomenon, and the fact that our news and other institutions are not reporting on it is an even more dangerous phenomenon because, well, while news is focused on other nonsense events that really don't have much impact on our day-to-day lives, particularly the mainstream media, isn't focusing on LIBOR at all or the full magnitude of the banking scandals. And to me, that is a direct indication of just how captured and captive the mainstream media is with the banks and institutions who are committing these fraud and gross crimes all across this country and that they're not doing their job to protect everyday Americans. Now, you'll notice that the blog recently has taken on a decidedly more political bent in areas that some folks suggest are outside the primary focus, which is raising the awareness of consumers about the fraud that are being committed in their name by the banks and institutions, and how the government and the officials that are elected there are corrupted such that they're not doing anything about it. And, you know, look, the campaign is directed at a state race, the Florida House of Representatives, but it has such a broad focus. You know, I'm talking about things like the CIA and defense contracting and the federal government. And frankly, those things may seem a bit attenuated for a state house candidate in a state house race. But the fact of the matter is all of these things are interconnected, and it's critical that we understand what all of this means. Now look, all of us that have been fighting foreclosure for years now have been talking about the fact that foreclosure is just a canary in a coal mine. The abuses that we see, the fraud, the misrepresentation, the gross crimes that are committed in the context of foreclosure documentation in particular, but just in the substance of the case, for years we've all been saying that these are simply indicators of much larger banking fraud and crimes that develop much higher up the food chain beyond our individual foreclosure case. And I know early on you had judges that would say, look, I don't want to listen to any of these bigger picture things, these allegations of fraud or abuse at the higher levels, because what does that have to do with this individual foreclosure case? Well, early on we had many judges that would get it, and, you know, particularly around in this area, judges that have a broadened perspective and a deeper commitment to what that job is to be a judge, an officer of the Constitution and protecting rights and liberty of Americans and particularly Floridians and citizens in their communities that got it. And I think judges all across the state now sitting at circuit court benches understand that there's something much deeper and much bigger going on in a foreclosure case. Well, what happens with the LIBOR scandal is it truly is confirmation that what we were saying way back when in 2007, 2016, if you look around me, a lot of these cases go back that far, 2007, 2008. And when you understand and read the documentation about the LIBOR banking scandal, you'll see that a lot of that, most of it, frankly, was developing right about then. And it's just very simple to understand. What LIBOR was bid rigging, was fixing the game. The banks and institutions over in England in particular would get together, 16 of them, and they would give a number that was supposed to reflect their borrowing costs. But in fact, that number was being artificially manipulated, fraudulently manipulated by the banks and institutions that were playing that game. And the result is that a false number was being presented that was then being transmitted and was affecting the borrowing costs all across this country and frankly all across the world. And the thing to keep in mind is that while there's only one institution right now that's directly being targeted, that'd be Barclays, it's clear that many, many other institutions, both in England and here in the United States of America, are being impacted and were directly complicit in the fraud that was the LIBOR scandal. Now, it's not just the LIBOR scandal that we're all treated to right now. We understand that HSBC, another huge international banking institution, was involved in money laundering. And frankly, we could just go down the list and talk about the London whale with JP Morgan Chase and the bad bets that were made there. We could talk about MF Global, but that's old news. Or we could talk about PF Paragon, again, another institution, a brokerage house where the CEO admits that he was fabricating statements, cutting, pasting, and literally like with crayons and with Elmer's glue, fabricating statements that went unnoticed and uncaught by the Securities and Exchange Commission for more than 20 years. What's the impact on the ground level in foreclosure in our cases here in state court? Well, again, foreclosure showed dramatically how fraud was being committed, document fraud and forgeries were being committed in the pursuit of individual foreclosure cases. And one of those frustrating things for myself as a practitioner down here at the ground level is when that fraud would be brought to attention, it would be ignored as if somehow it were unimportant, not meaningful. But the fact of the matter is, and this is what we've been screaming for so long, is that this fraud that we see down at the ground level in these foreclosure cases, and we document down there at the ground level, right here behind me, that we see documented in these cases, was just the canary in the coal mine. And if the banks and institutions were so arrogant and out of control to know and understand that they could commit fraud in all of these cases back here, then that was clearly an indication that the fraud went much higher. And in fact, that's what we find, is that the fraud that the banks and institutions were engaging in goes so much higher than what happened in individual foreclosure cases. Now, what does this mean as it bubbles up the food chain? Well, I really encourage everyone to pay attention to this book that Neil Barofsky put out. Neil was a special prosecutor first, and then he became the inspector general. And Barofsky's job was to go into the government, especially after 2008, when billions of dollars of taxpayer money were being doled out to the banks and institutions. Barofsky was supposed to be the sheriff, if you will, to look at where this money was going. And as the excerpts of his book are making quite clear, it was absolutely apparent that Barofsky was a figurehead only, that the administration, the government that set this up, that was supposed to protect you and I, the taxpayers that were shoveling hundreds of billions of dollars to these banks and institutions, were not going to allow any oversight at all of the banks and institutions that received all this. And so Barofsky's book is going to be quite compelling because the quotes that he have of direct confrontations with folks like Geithner and the banking and the other institutions is an indictment of our entire system of government. It's more confirmation of what I talk about when I make allegations about our government and being fascist now. And I don't just throw that term around in hyperbole. I mean it very clearly and very specifically that the United States government has, at all levels, federal, state, and local, exhibits many of the key elements of fascism. And what Barofsky's book appears to document so far from the anecdotes we've read is direct confirmation of these elements of fascism. And what are the key elements of fascism that I'm talking about? Specifically, the capture of our government and its use by the corporations that our government is supposed to be reining in. And there can be no more clear example of fascism than when our government money, our taxpayer money, is being shoveled directly to private institutions, and then the high-level players in those private institutions that are receiving this money are able to then squelch out any protest, squelch out any kind of regulation or oversight that our government might impact on those institutions. So that blending together of the corporate interest and the government interest into one to become the fascist interest that we see playing out all across this country and offering no protection at all to consumers. So key elements of Barofsky's book again, and these are the kind of things we've been screaming about down in the trenches for years now. It's that in 2008 especially, when we heard about all these government programs out there that were supposed to help consumers and were supposed to help protect us from foreclosure, they received billions of dollars, and yet that money never made it to help consumers. The banks and institutions shoveled that in their coffers and then passed that along to the executives, and precious little, if anything, ever came to benefit the American consumer. So we really need to pay attention to Borofsky's book because it makes it clear that these allegations we've been raising down here at the state court level for years now were very much legitimate. Now, how do we use this as a practical matter, defending ourselves in state court? Well, first of all, I really applaud all the consumers that were able to go out there and defend themselves for years as pro se consumers. But that era of security, thinking that you could defend yourself, is very much coming to a close. I'm getting pounded now with pleadings and papers. It's clear that there's a big push to move these cases forward right now. And what I'm seeing is consumers in particular who had been defending themselves for years are getting hammered on this. If you had filed pleadings in your case and it had delayed it, please understand that you were living under a false sense of security. The only reason why your case was not moving forward is because the plaintiffs, for their own reasons, were deciding not to, and frankly, the courts were not. But as these cases start to move forward, you're going to find hearings being held, summary judgments being set, and foreclosure sales being set that are going to result in the loss of your home. And if you continue to sit there undefended by an experienced and qualified foreclosure defense attorney, you're going to find yourself victimized. That's on the very small level. On the much bigger picture level, what we all need to be focused on is the political environment that we live in, where dissent is being squelched, where protesters are being targeted, where attorneys and advocates who are seeking to defend and protect the Constitution and the rule of law and the little guy are in fact being targeted and persecuted. Anytime we see that happen, especially attorneys, we need to stand up and protect and defend those attorneys and those advocates who are being targeted by that. And more importantly, we need to recognize the political environment and change that political situation that's allowing that to happen. That means drawing a light on the corruption and the fraud that persists among our body politic, and then focusing back on our elected circuit court judges in particular who are responsive to the needs of their consumers down here and constituents down at a local level. That's critically important, the fact that our judges are defenders of the consumers and the citizens that live around them, and we need to continue to educate our good judges out there who are doing their job to support, defend, and protect their communities.